Welcome. This is an introductory video to Adobe Photoshop, the industry standard software for digital art, photo editing and graphic design. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the basics to get you started. By the end, you should be able to open Photoshop, navigate its interface, open files, save files, and perform some fundamental tasks. So if you haven't already, go ahead and open Photoshop. On Windows, you can do that from the taskbar at the bottom of the screen, and if you're on a Mac, you can find it in your Applications folder. Once open, you should see the home screen, which is what we're looking at here. And you can create a new file or open existing files. If this is your first time opening Photoshop, take a moment to explore the home screen. You will usually find recently opened files, and there are also tutorials that you can access in this home screen. If you click on the Learn button, you'll have access to a variety of tutorials from the Adobe Learn site. And if you have already opened files in Photoshop, you should see a set of recently opened files down in this area down here. Photoshop might prompt you to sign in with your Adobe ID if you haven't already, and of course that would be your school ID if you're on a machine at school that has the Adobe software installed. Okay, so let's open a file. To open a file in Photoshop, go to the Open menu in the home screen, click on that, and that will open up an Explorer window if you're on a Windows machine, and a Finder window if you're on a Mac. And you can select your file and click Open to open it. It will appear in your workspace ready to be edited. If you need to open multiple files, repeat the process. Go to the File, Open menu, and select multiple files by holding down the Control key on the PC and the Command key on the Mac. Click Open. And it will open your files. Each of them will be open in a new tab, making it easy to switch between them, just as you would between web pages in a browser. You can also drag and drop files onto this area in the home screen area, and it will also open up images in a new tab as well. Once you have your files open in Photoshop, we can take a quick tour of the Photoshop interface. Make sure you're using the Essentials workspace for a standardized setup. If your workspace looks different than the one that I'm using here, go to Window, Workspace, and choose the Essentials default workspace. And if you have palettes that are moved around or closed, you can always return to that Essentials default workspace by choosing Reset Essentials, and that will open up those essential palettes that we need to do our work. The toolbar over here on the left-hand side of the screen can be moved around. I like to click on the two arrows at the top to make my toolbar into a two-column toolbar, easier to see if you have a small workspace. And when we move that toolbar to the extreme left of our screen, you can see we get a blue glow there, letting us know that when we drop that, let go of the mouse cursor, we will drop that toolbar into place there at the edge of our interface. In this toolbar, you'll see a variety of tools. Almost all of the tools, I think at this point, have a little arrow in the lower right hand corner letting you know that there are more tools hiding underneath the visible tool, and if you click and hold the mouse button down, you will see those extra tools. When we hover our cursor over a tool, Photoshop will pop up a quick tool tip with the option of watching a video to see what each of the tools does.
It's an easy way to make selections in your images, as it automatically finds and follows.
Right, so those little videos are available to you to watch and get a sense of what each of the tools does. The tools are laid out somewhat according to their purpose. The tools at the very top here are the selection tools, and then we have some of the modification tools, move tool, the brush and the eraser tool, and several other tools. The text tool here we'll be talking about in a little bit. So, a wide variety of tools here. You should familiarize yourself with most of the important ones through this video. As you select a different tool, the options palette, which is here at the top of the screen right beneath the file menu, will change to give you different options for whichever tool is selected. So as we click on the different tools in the toolbar, you will see that that option bar changes to give you different options for that individual tool. Selections that you can change are things like opacity, brush size, blending mode. For the marquee tool here, we have a feather ratio. For the move tool, we have a variety of different tools as well. Another very important palette to be aware of in the interface here is the layers palette. We'll be talking a lot about layers. They are one of the major components of the Photoshop interface and allow you to stack and composite your images in different layers in the application to build up an image through a stacking of layers. This is going to help you manage different parts of your project. The Properties panel just above that provides details and adjustments for your current selection, similar to the Options palette. The menu bar at the top contains drop-down menus for very essential functions like File and Edit, Edit menu, Image, Layer, and many more we'll take a look at in a little while. Note the window menu. If you happen to have a palette that's closed or a panel that's closed, you can find it here in the window drop-down menu and select it, and that will open that window back up again. For instance, here we have the color, the layers, and the properties palettes checked, letting us know that those three palettes are open. You can customize your workspace by rearranging or closing panels as you need. If you, again, ever feel lost, you can reset the Essentials workspace, ensuring that all the panels are in their default position. When you have files open in Photoshop, like we have here in these three tabs, it's a good idea to check the size and resolution of your files, especially if you're going to be compositing those images together, pasting one image into another image. To check the size of your files, you would go to Image, Image Size, and here you can see the pixel dimensions of your file. In this case, that's 1435 pixels by 1920 pixels. And you can see the resolution of your file. Here we have a resolution of 72 ppi, which is standard for screen resolution. And we can also see that the physical size, if we were to print this image out at 72 ppi or dpi, would be 26 by 6 inches by 19.9 inches, a very large file printed at a very low resolution. The resample button allows us to adjust the size without affecting the resolution, so we could change the size and resolution independently of each other by checking the resample button. If we want to change the resolution to make a higher resolution image, that will cause the size to be reduced, as the size, physical size and resolution are inversely proportional, unless of course you have that resample button checked. However, when you do check that resample button, Photoshop will reduce or enlarge the amount of data in the image. We'll just go back here to our 72 pixels per inch resolution, and that brings us back up to that 26 by 19 physical width and height. And then if we check resample and try and change the resolution to 300 at that larger size, you can see in the preview that we've become kind of pixelated as Photoshop tries to make up information that is not there, and the size of the file has gone from 7.88 megabytes to 136.8 megabytes, a huge difference. That information is being added out of thin air. Photoshop is just making that up. So in general, that's not something you want to do. If you need to change the size of an image, you need to make sure that you're not losing or gaining resolution when you're doing that, so you would uncheck resample. I'm going to take that back down to 72 dpi so that we go back to our initial size there, and we have our dimensions the way they were when we opened the file, and we'll click OK without making any changes. And then we'll go to one of our other images here and we'll check the file size for that one. That looks comparable, 1920 by 1488 at 72 dpi. And finally our third image size, again 1920 by 1269. So now that we know that all of these images have the same resolution and they are approximately the same pixel size, it gives us a good idea that when we start to paste one object into another, that we're not going to have either an image that's way too large or an image that's very, very tiny and needs to be blown up. So one of the things you want to make sure of when you are compositing images together, when you're pasting one image into another, is that your file sizes are relatively the same. That isn't to say that you can't blow things up a little bit or shrink things down a little bit. Computers do a pretty good job of doing that, but when you start to make very large changes, either enlarging an image or reducing an image, you may run into some visual problems. One other note in passing is that when you are trying to print an item, I mentioned that 300 pixels per inch is a print quality resolution. So whereas we have 72 pixels per inch for images displayed on screen, we have 300 pixels per inch for print resolution. So ideally, if you are making an image for print, you want to start your image at 300 pixels per inch, and if you are making an image for the screen like we'll be doing today, we can use 72 pixels per inch resolution. When you want to move an image from one file to another, you can simply copy and paste that image just like you would in a word processor. If we go to our eye image that we have open, you can see if you zoom in on this image using the Control+ command that we have a grid of pixels. That's what a Photoshop document is just a grid of differently colored and valued pixels. We'll use the Control- key to zoom back out of our image. To copy this image and paste it into the constellation image that we have open, we can select that entire grid of pixels by using the Select All command from the Select menu, or we can use the keyboard shortcut for Select All, which you can see here is Control A. We'll hit Control A on our keyboard. That would be Command A on a Macintosh computer. And what that does is it selects that entire grid of pixels, and we can see that that is selected because we have a marquee around our entire image, these marching ants, if you will. And that will allow us to select every pixel in the image and then copy that so that we can paste it into the other image. To copy the image, you can use the command in the Edit menu, Edit, Copy, or the keyboard equivalent, which is Control C, which is what we'll do, Control C to copy the image. And then we'll click on the tab for the image that we want to paste into, and we'll use the keyboard shortcut, which is also found in the Edit menu, Control V to paste the image. Once we paste the image, we can see that Photoshop brings it into a new layer over here in the Layers palette that completely covers up the layer below it. So the pixels in the eyeball image are opaque and completely hide the layer below. We'll look at the Layers palette in more detail soon, but for the moment know that you can click on the eyeball icon to the left of the image in each layer to hide or show that particular layer. Excuse me. When you want to paste an image like the stopwatch into another image, you can see that in the background of the stopwatch we have this gray checkerboard. That's Photoshop's way of telling you that the image is transparent at the place where you can see that gray checkerboard. If we use our keyboard shortcut, again, Control or Command A to select the entire image, we now get a marquee around the entire image. And we can use the command Control C or Command C from the keyboard on a Mac to copy it, and then go back to our constellation image and use the command or Control V keyboard shortcut to paste just the stopwatch image into the constellation document. So you can see that it did not copy the transparent areas, it only copied the areas that were opaque pixels in the stopwatch layer. Now you'll also note that the stopwatch image is cut off slightly. That tells us that the stopwatch image had more pixels in the vertical dimension than the constellation image that we pasted it into. Right? We'll look at a moment in how to resize those images that you've pasted into another document if you need to change the size or scale of them. So once you've pasted the stopwatch into the eyeball image, you may want to change the size of it or rotate it or move it to a different location, and you can do all those things using a couple of tools and commands. So by default we're on the Move tool here in the toolbar. You can see that that's the sort of arrowed cross that's there, and that will allow us to move an image around. So if we click on the stopwatch in the stopwatch layer, we can click it and we can drag it around the image using the Move tool. So that will allow us to reposition it. If we were on the layer with the eyeball, it would allow us to click and move that layer around behind the stopwatch and in front of the constellation layer. So you can see how the Move tool allows you to move different layers depending on which layer you have selected as being active. So we'll activate the stopwatch layer here once again, and we'll bring the stopwatch down here so that we can see the uppermost edges. And after you paste it, you might need to resize it to fit your composition properly. To do this, to ensure that the pasted layer is selected, right? So we've selected the stopwatch layer, and we can go to the Edit menu and choose Free Transform, or use the keyboard shortcut Control-T on the Windows or Command-T on the Mac. So Control-T, and that will bring up a set of control handles around your layer that you have selected, in this case the stopwatch, to be able to click and drag the handles to change the size or the rotation of this particular image layer. If I mouse over the corner handle and I drag that down, right, you can see that not only am I changing the scale, but I'm also distorting the image somewhat. I can make it distorted in the X dimension, I can make it distorted in the Y dimension. If I want to keep the same proportions, I'll just hit Control or Command Z from the keyboard to undo those changes. A very important command to remember, Control or Command Z. If you hold down the Shift key while you're dragging the window or the control handle for the stopwatch, it allows you to change the size or the scale of the image proportionally. So again, holding down the Shift key and dragging that corner will allow me to change the scale of the image and keep the proportions the same. Now I can mouse over at any time and move the image around, because while I'm in the Transform tool and I'm not dragging one of these handles, I have access to the Move tool. I can also grab this side handle if I want to distort the image in that dimension. I can do that on the vertical axis as well. You just undo those changes and get back to our original proportions. One other thing that you can do with the transform, the free transform control handles, is if you hold your cursor outside one of the outer edges of these control handles, you see your cursor changes to a sort of curved two-headed arrow tool. And then if you click and drag when you see that tool, it will let you rotate your object around the center point of the image. You can see there's a little, just undo that. There is a little center point here that I can move around, and wherever I move that point to will be the axis around which the rotation tool functions. So if I move that down here to the very corner, now my image will rotate around that point instead, right? So very handy thing to know how to do. Again, you have the Shift key to constrain the rotation, and if you use that, it will constrain the rotation to, I think, 20-degree increments or thereabouts, maybe 10-degree increments. So that's a way to constrain the angle at which you are rotating. When you're done making your changes to the stopwatch, we'll just put it here over the iris of the eye, and maybe we'll rotate it just slightly. Let's bring our point back to the center, and it will sort of snap into place when you get back to the center. And then we'll rotate that around a little bit so that we match the rotation of the eye there. When you've got your image lined up the way you want, you can hit Return, and that will accept those changes for the Transform tool. Okay, now that we've pasted a couple of different layers into our image, we want to make some selections within these layers. Knowing how to make selections is a really great thing to know how to do, how to make different kinds of selections to select different kinds of data within your Photoshop document. So let's hide the stopwatch layer. I'm going to click on the eyeball here in the stopwatch layer and the eyeball to the left of the eyeball layer, and hide both of those layers so we're just looking at our constellation background layer. I'm going to grab the marquee tool from the toolbar, which is the M key. The keyboard shortcut for the marquee tool is the M key on the keyboard. And we will click and drag a marquee in the center of our constellation image. Once we let go of the mouse button, Photoshop shows us a marching ants marquee around the area that we dragged over. And that's telling us that this part of the image that's bounded by the marquee is what we're interested in working with. We're going to either paint, or we're going to copy this part of the image, or we're going to apply a filter to it. But we're just letting Photoshop know that this is the part of the image that we want to work with. If I click inside that selection, I can move that selection around. I can change it by transforming it. If we go to the selection menu and choose transform selection, we get, again, like we saw with the control handles for the transform tool, we can change the size of just the selection. So be aware that there's a difference between transform, free transform that we used to transform the actual pixels, and then transform selection, which you can use to just transform the selection marquee. And of course, we can hit return to accept those changes. Once we have our selection made, if you want to deselect that selection and make a new selection, you can either click outside the selection, click out here on the workspace, and that will undo the selection. You can also go to the select menu and you can choose deselect or reselect, and we'll reselect that. You can also deselect something by using the keyboard shortcut, which is Control or Command D. Oh, sorry, not Win Control D, Control D or Command D on the Mac. So we'll just go to the select menu and reselect that again so that we have our marquee, our rectangular marquee selection. Now, if you want to make a circular selection, an elliptical selection, hold the mouse button down on the rectangular marquee and you can choose the elliptical marquee tool. Click and drag, and you can see that that allows us to make elliptical selections of any size in our image. And again, we can click in the center of that and move that selection around. You could choose Select Transform Selection and transform this selection using those transform selection tools as well. We don't always want to make an elliptical selection. Sometimes we want to make a selection that's a perfect circle. It's kind of hard to get the elliptical marquee tool to make a perfect circle because you never know when it's exactly perfectly round. So we have a keyboard shortcut, the Shift key, that will allow us to constrain the elliptical marquee to a perfect circle. So if you hold that Shift key down and click and drag with the elliptical marquee, you can see that it only lets us make perfect circles of any size. Right? So we'll make that selection and then drag that to the center of the image, and we get these guides that are very handy that are on by default that tell us when that circle is right in the center of our image. So that's a little handy thing to be able to line up your selections where you need them to be. All right, so now that we have a perfect circle, let's say we want to select everything that's not this circle, right? So we've made the circle in the selection, but what we really want to do is we want to select the background, everything around the circle. To do that, we can use the Select Inverse command, which is Select Inverse from the Select menu. There's also a keyboard shortcut, which is 3 different keys, Shift, Control, and I. Now you can see once we select the Select Inverse command, the marching ants are around the outside edge as well as our circle, letting us know that this section outside of the circle is all now selected. We can test that by grabbing our paintbrush tool, which is the B key from the keyboard, and painting. And if we try and paint inside the circle, you can see that nothing happens. But the minute our paintbrush goes outside the circle, we are painting with the white paint that you see here in the foreground color of our paint chip palette at the bottom of the toolbar. So we can paint outside of the circle all we want, but it won't let us paint inside of the circle because that is not selected. Right? We can undo those paint marks by hitting Control-Z on our keyboard a couple of times, and we can invert that selection yet again, select inverse, and now we will have just the inside of the circle selected, and we can test that by trying to paint out here, and now it will only let us paint inside the circle. Right? So we can paint inside the selection but not outside the selection. Just undo those paint strokes and we'll hit Control-D to deselect. Right? Some other things that are good to know about the basic selection tools. We'll go back to our rectangular marquee tool and make a rectangular selection. You can add multiple selections together. So if we have a rectangular selection and we want to add another rectangular selection to it, we can hold down again the Shift key, and that will let us click and drag and add a selection to the selection that we already have. So Shift will also constrain in the case of when you're trying to create a perfect circle with an elliptical marquee, and it will also add to an existing selection. We can add as many selections as we want to that original selection. We can even add a non-contiguous selection. Right? So now we have this very complicated rectangular selection that we've made by adding multiple rectangular selections together. We could also add a circular selection if we wanted to. We click and drag. We'll click and drag an elliptical marquee. Sorry about that. Just undo that, and then we'll hold down the Shift key and we can add an elliptical marquee selection to that as well. And the other thing you can do with the marquee tool is you can subtract from selections by using the Option key or Alt key keyboard shortcut. So if we hold down the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on the Mac, you can see that our cursor gets a little minus sign beside it. That lets us know that if we click and drag now, we will be subtracting from our selection instead of adding to the selection. Right? So we can add or subtract from selections. We'll subtract a little circle window out of that selection as well, and now we can see what's selected and what's not selected by grabbing our paintbrush tool and trying to paint within these selections. And you can see that we have down in this area we have a selection that's added that has a hole in it, as does this one, and these areas extend out beyond the selections. Right, so we made some very complicated selections there just using the simplest marquee tools, the rectangular and the elliptical marquee tool. Just undo that with Control-Z and then use the keyboard shortcut Control-D to deselect that particular marquee. All right, now we can make other kinds of selections. If we look at the second tool down on the left-hand side, we have the lasso tools. The second tool down there in the list is the lasso tool, and the lasso tool lets you make free form selections. So we can draw with that just like we would with a pencil, and we can make irregularly shaped selections. If you've ever tried to draw with a mouse, you know that can be kind of difficult to do. So you may not want to use the lasso tool to freehand draw your selections very much unless you have very loose selections that you need to make. Undo that selection. Another tool that's here is underneath the lasso tool is the polygonal lasso tool, and the polygonal lasso tool is a little bit hard to get used to, but you click once with the polygonal lasso tool on your image and it gives you a sort of rubber band line that is a selection line, and wherever you click next, it will make a straight line between those 2 points. And then we can make another click and another and another, and then go back to our original starting point, and the cursor changes to have a little circle telling you that it's going to end at that point, and click over that origin point, and it will create a closed marquee selection. So you can make differently shaped hard edge selections using the polygonal lasso tool. Again, it takes a little getting used to. You can play around with that and learn how to make selections using the polygonal lasso tool. Just undo those using Control Z. The next selection tools that I want to show you are the quick selection tools, and they live on the second row down on the right hand column. And the quick selection tool works by selecting all of the adjacent colors that are similar to the color that you click on when you first use the tool. So I'm going to click in an area of my image and then just sort of drag the selection tool around, and you can see that it's sort of adding to the selection as I go to select some of these cloud shapes that are a similar color here in the constellation. So you can create a more organic looking selection using the quick selection tool, and of course that works a little bit better when you have an image with a solid color that you're clicking and dragging through. This image doesn't really have that, so it's not an ideal image to use for this particular tool. I think instead let's open up a new image that has a bit of color in it in order to better utilize the quick selection tool. So I'm going to go to File, Open, and scroll through my images that I have selected here, and I'm going to open up this butterfly JPEG. Double click on it, open that up. You can see that it's fairly small file, so I'm using Control Plus to make that a little bit bigger on screen. And now you can see by looking up here at the tab, I'm actually looking at this image at 200 times its actual size. Right? So if we zoom back out again, Control minus, zoom back in and out using the Control minus and Control Plus keyboard shortcut, now I can see that I'm looking at this at 100% of its actual size. So that's another bit of information that you can get from the toolbar. I'll just zoom back in on that one more time. So to select with the quick selection tool, as I pointed out, you can click on the area of the color that you're trying to select. In this case, I want to select the orange color of the butterfly's wings. So I'm going to start clicking there and drag my selection marquee through the orange areas. And you can see as I drag my marquee, continue to drag it over the yellowish parts of this image, the selection is made for me automatically. Right? So I can select this entire wing of the butterfly, and if I wanted to, I could continue to shift or continue to click and drag throughout the entire butterfly. I mentioned that we can add the Shift key to add to selections, and we can do that here as well using any of the selection tools. Hold down the Shift key and click and drag through the other wing, and that will also bring that wing into the selection. And when we finish, I'll just go down here and get the tail as well and see if we can get some of the head, and then we let go of the mouse and we can see that we've got our entire butterfly selected. Now you'll notice that it's selected part of the green background here at the bottom of the butterfly, and that's one of the limitations of this quick selection tool, is it's not always terribly accurate about where it's selecting. Some of the colors here at the bottom, these greens, these yellow greens and these blue greens, are similar enough that the tool selected them as well. I'll just do Control Z to undo both of those selections. And we'll click on the Quick Selection tool and choose another of the tools in the Quick Selection tool category, the Object Selection tool. And Object Selection tool is a tool that
really amazingly well at analyzing your image and trying to detect the different parts of your image. And here you can see it's doing a pretty good job of detecting what is the background and what is the foreground of the image. So the butterfly or the background. In this case, it's still messing up a little bit. You can see that there's a little bit of green there at the bottom of the butterfly, letting us know that that won't be a perfect selection. But if I click on the butterfly image itself, you can see that it does a pretty good job, even so much as to select most of the antenna of the butterfly, which we could then copy and paste into a new document. So the Quick Selection tool and the Object Selection tool are two variations on the selection tools that allow you to do different types of selections based on either object or color. The Magic Wand tool, the third tool in this trio of tools, also lets us select based on color. Just undo our existing selection. But it depends. It's kind of like the Quick Selection tool that you make one click at a time. I can control the tolerance for the amount of colors that are going to be included when I click. So if I click on this orange color here, you can see that it tries to select all of the pixels next to that color that I clicked on that are within a certain tolerance range. And that tolerance is set here in the options palette. If we turn that tolerance up to 100 and then deselect the pixels we already have selected, and I click in the same spot, you can see that it selects more of the wing. So by fine-tuning this tolerance, you can actually try and increase or decrease the amount of area selected based on where you click with the image. So again, that one takes a little getting used to and is for very specialized cases. I think you're probably initially going to have better luck with the Quick Selection tool or the Object Selection tool, which make those selections a little bit more automated. I want to take a look at the shape tools. The shape tools are here in the bottom of the palette on the right hand side, just above the magnifying glass. And I think to do this, we'll go back to our constellation image, make sure that your stopwatch layer and your eyeball layer are hidden, and we're on the background constellation layer. Now, if we were to make a marquee selection here, right, we'll make a rectangular marquee selection, and we'll fill that with pixels by going to Edit, Fill, and we'll just choose black here as our fill color and click OK. And that command will fill the selection marquee in this layer. It'll take all of those pixels and make them black or make them a particular color. If we zoom in on that really closely, we can see that what we have is a grid of pixels, and each one has been colored uniformly with the color black. The shape tool works a little bit differently. I'm just going to undo that and undo our marquee. The shape tool actually makes something called vector-based shapes. And we'll look at vector-based shapes more closely when we work with Illustrator, which uses only vector-based shapes. Vector-based shapes are shapes that are made up of points and the lines that connect them, and those shapes that are made by those points and lines can then be filled with a solid color, and the outside edges can be stroked with a color as well. So let's take a look at how to make those, and you'll note as we start making shapes with the shape tool that they exist on their own separate layers. So I'm going to just draw a click on the shape tool here, the rectangular shape tool, click and drag, And at the moment, it looks just exactly like the marquee tool, except when we let go of the mouse, we have a solidly filled shape with some control handles around it. Now, when we're on the shape tool, you can look up here at the options palette at the top of the screen, and you see a few things that we haven't seen before. We have something called a fill, and that fill has the color red, and that fill is the fill color for the shape that we've just made, this rectangular shape. If we click on that fill color, we bring up the Photoshop color picker, the color palette, and we can choose in the upper right of that palette the color picker. And when we click on that, it opens up the Photoshop color picker that allows us to change to a different color. You have a main window here that is the tints and shades, as well as the saturation intensity of that color. If I want to choose a less saturated version, I can see my current version versus the new version, and that changes as we mouse around within that square. If we want to change to a different hue, we can grab this slider over here on the right, and that will let us slide through the 360 degrees of the color wheel and choose a different hue. Right, so I'm going to choose a hue of sort of turquoise color and make that a fairly light saturated turquoise. Click OK, and then my shape will change to whatever color I select in the color picker. Now, the other thing about shapes is that they can have a stroke around the outside edge that can be a different color and a different size than the actual fill color. So if I click on stroke here, you can see that by default it has a white background with a red line through it, meaning there will be no stroke. I can choose to have a stroke. Again, I'll pick the color picker, and maybe we'll pick a dark blue color for the stroke of this image. Click OK. And now my image, my rectangular shape, gets stroked with a dark blue outline, which you can barely see here because it's only 1 pixel in width. If I change that to 10 pixels and hit return, then you can see that now I have a fairly large 10 pixel wide. Actually, I have 101 pixels. I didn't want to make it quite that big. So make that back to 10 pixels. That's a bit better. So now I have a 10 pixel border around my turquoise shape. Maybe we'll make that a bit wider so we can see it. 50 pixels and hit return, and there we go. So now we have a turquoise colored shape with a 50 pixel dark blue border. So in that way you can make a variety of different simple shapes, and the nice thing about vector-based shapes is not only can you control the shape on the fly by using these control handles. We could change the shape by grabbing that like we did with the transform tool. We can make it taller or shorter. We can also grab these corner handles and change the outside edges. So if we wanted to make a sort of a stop sign shape with rounded edges, we can grab these corners and actually pull that in until it's almost an elliptical shape. Drag that back out and leave it with those rounded corners. So very malleable, very easy to change the parameters, and we can click on the move tool, the V key on the keyboard, and then we can move that shape around, and you'll see that it exists on a completely separate layer from the pixel-based images that we have. Now there are a variety of different shape tools. If we hold the mouse button down, we can see that there's also an ellipse tool that will let us draw ellipses, and of course it will take on the same characteristics, whatever they are, in the shape options palette here. So that's an elliptical shape. We can constrain that to a perfect circle if we hold down the shift key, and that will make a circular ellipse, a circular shape. There's also the triangle tool, so we can make triangular shapes, right? And there's the polygon tool, which we can make different kinds of polygons. You can see that this has multiple sides. And finally, the line tool, which lets us draw lines, and those lines have a particular fill and a stroke as well. So lots of different things you can do with the shape tools. We can also convert those shape tools to pixels if we want to, so they play nicely with all of the other pixel-based images in our file. To convert those to pixels, select the layer, right-click on the layer, and you can choose to convert those pixels you convert that shape to pixels by choosing rasterize layer. Rasterization is the process of turning a vector-based shape into a grid of pixels, a pixel-based shape. So now this is no longer a vector. You can see that the layer has changed. It doesn't have the little vector-based icon in the lower right anymore. It's now become a grid of pixels. And if we zoom in on that, we can see that now we do have a grid of pixels there. And we can no longer move that around in the same way that we moved the shape tools. Okay, so that's the shape tool. There's also, if we click on the shape tool at the very bottom, we can go to the custom shape tool. And the custom shape tool allows us to use in the options palette this pop-up of different kinds of custom shapes. You can see that I have wild animals. If we wanted to make a, let's say, a camel shape, click on the camel shape, and now we can draw the shape of a camel with a turquoise fill and a blue outline. If we want to change that outline to be more of a smaller outline so we can see the camel shape, there we have that. And when we click away, we can see we've drawn a camel shape. Like I say, the nice thing about vectors is you can scale them up, scale them down, and they don't lose their sharpness. They stay the same kind of sharp resolution no matter how big or how small you make them. Okay, now we'll add some text to our image, and text in Photoshop is also vector-based, meaning it remains crisp and scalable without losing any of its quality when you scale it up. To add text to your document, you're going to want to select the text tool, which is the T icon over here in your toolbar. And when you click in your image with the text tool, you get a selection of text that comes up automatically, and that text will take on the color of whatever the foreground color is in your paint palette here. Or if you look at the options palette at the top of the screen, you can see there's also a paint chip here where we can change the color of that text. And we'll just change that to a white color. Click OK. And when the text is selected, it looks like the opposite color. So if we just click in that text, you can see that it is a white text. Now it's behind this shape, right? It's behind that shape, so we're not seeing part of the text. And I've created a new layer for my text. So if I click and drag that layer above the layer for the shape, the line shape there, now that sits on top of the line shape, and we can see all of that text. We'll talk about the layers and how to manipulate them momentarily. But for now, we want to work with the text. And again, if we click inside the text, we can reinsert our cursor so that we can add text if we want to. Just undo that. We can select a part of the text if we want to change that text, or we want to change the color of just that part of the text. If we mouse outside of the text, we get a cursor with a move tool that lets us move our text around, and we can move that so that it's right over the line. We have a lot of options in terms of changing the size of the text, the actual font of the text. To change the font, we want to select all of the text. I'm going to click and drag just like I would in a word processor, and come up to our options palette, and we have a pop-up here with a bajillion different types of fonts that we can choose from. We'll just choose let's choose Gil Sans. Actually, maybe we'll choose a serif font like Century Gothic, not a sans serif font, but let's try Palatino. It's a serif font. And while it's also selected, we can change the size. We'll come here to the font size and change that to a much smaller font size. There you can see that we've changed it so that it fits within our shape line, our line shape. Make that just a little bit bigger so we can see it. We'll go to 36 points, move that over a little bit, and there we have our white font. Let's actually change that to a text that's a little more meaningful. This is a text. Oh, accidentally hit return. Text layer. And we can move that over a little bit. There's our text layer, and we have created a layer of text. And you can see that that has come in on its own separate layer. Once we click on another layer, the text layer will adopt the name of whatever the text is that you typed in that layer. Right? Now, text functions exactly like shape does. It's a vector-based object, so it has it's made up of points and the lines that connect them, so you can do the same thing that you could do with a shape. With the text, you can make it larger or smaller without losing any of the sharp edges of that text. Other things that you can do with text, let me just make a new text layer. So I'm going to create a text layer that's within a text box by clicking and dragging with my text tool, and that will create a text box. And the text that I type within that box will be constrained by that box, and I can make that text box smaller or larger by clicking and dragging on the text box frame. You can see it also gives me some placeholder text here, this sort of phony Latin, and I can use that just for the moment to adjust the text using the character palette, which you can access by clicking on this button at the top in the options palette. That will open the character palette that gives you a variety of different ways to adjust the text. You can adjust the leading, which is the line spacing. You can adjust the tracking, which is the letter spacing, the kerning, which is the space between specific characters. You can adjust the justification of the text columns here. So I've got this text box. If I wanted that to be left-hand justified, I could choose that control, right-hand justified, or if I wanted it to be block text that was centered or block text that was justified either to left and right, I could do that here in the paragraph palette. So a variety of different ways that we can manipulate text. Here in the character palette, I can also increase the size of that text. I think I want to change that back to a left-hand justified text. And I can also change the color of the text here by using the color picker in the character palette. Now you'll also see all of these transformation tools over here in the properties palette as well. So we have a variety of different places that we can control the look and the feel of our text, either in the Properties palette, the Character palette, or the Options palette. And again, these text blocks can be moved around by simply moving your cursor when you're on the text tool outside of your text and clicking and dragging and moving that around. Click back inside it to reactivate it, and I can move it anywhere I want in my layer. All right. So now I have two text layers. I'm going to click back on one of the other layers to set that layer. And if I want to manipulate that text again, I have to reselect that layer, and with the text tool, click back inside of the text, and I can select a part of that text and delete it, or type in a new word if I so choose. So lots of ways that you can manipulate text layers. Okay, so I want to take a look at layers now. Layers are the foundation of Photoshop's editing workflow. They allow you to work on individual elements of your design separately while maintaining flexibility, and you can organize layers and use them to move different parts of your image around, etc. So let's go over how to manage layers efficiently in the Layers panel. We've looked at how to hide layers. You can turn the eyeball off and on in a layer to hide it or show it. We've got our eye layer here. You'll notice that the text is above the eye layer, and in the layer stack, anything that's above is visible, and if it's below a opaque series of pixels, it is hidden. So in this case, the background, which is just peeping out on the right here, which is all the way at the bottom of our layer stack, is completely covered up by all of these things on top of it, the largest of which is this eyeball. And at the top of that layer stack is the stopwatch, and then the text out here is also on top of the eyeball, but not intersecting the stopwatch. If I were to grab the text tool and move this text over in near the stopwatch, you'd see that that layer is actually below the stopwatch and would be hidden by it if it were in the same spot as the stopwatch. So I can delete layers. Let me just hide my eyeball here and my stopwatch, and we'll delete some of these shape layers. To delete layers, you can either select them and hit the delete key. I think that will work. And another way to delete layers is to click on the layer and drag it down to the bottom of the layer palette, down here to the trash can icon. And you can delete layers that way as well. So I'm just going to delete this ellipse layer as well by dragging it to the trash can. And that leaves us with just the line layer and this rectangular shape layer and the camel shape layer. We can move layers around by dragging them in the stack. So if I wanted the this is text layer and the line and the camel and the rectangle to be above the eyeball layer, I could select all of those by holding down the Shift key and selecting each of those layers, and then drag all of those layers up above the eyeball. And you can see when I pass over a join between layers that I get a little blue highlight. That's letting me know if I let go of the mouse at that point, then the layers are going to be dropped and they are now above the eyeball layer. So if I turn that on, we can see that those layers now are above the eyeball layer. I did not bring the text layer that says this is a text layer, and I'll bring that up now to the very top, and it will appear above the blue line. So you can move layers, you can delete layers, you can hide layers, but I haven't showed you how to make a new layer. If you want to make a new layer, you can click on the plus sign here just to the left of the trash can at the bottom of the layers panel. Click on the plus sign and that will create a new layer. All right. One of the things that I find is very valuable to do when you're creating layers is to name your layer. Some of our layers here are all sort of named generically: line 1, camel 1, layer 1, rectangle 1. If we double click on the title of the layer there, we can rename that. I'm going to just call this eyeball. And that way we can see visually, no pun intended, exactly what the contents of that layer are. So, for instance, this layer 2 is the stopwatch. I'll rename that stopwatch. And that will make it easier for people that I'm working with to know what's on the individual layers. Now, another tool that we have for organization with the Layers palette is we can create folders. So I'm going to click on the icon. The third one over from the right here is the folder icon, and that will appear above your active layer, and you can also click and rename that. And I'm going to put all of my text into this one grouped folder. So I'm going to call it text, and then I can drag my text layers into that folder and organize them in that way. So I can close that, and now all of my text layers appear inside that folder. And I can hide or show those all at once if I want to. So use those folders to organize your layers and make sure that you're naming your layers appropriately in order to facilitate collaboration with other people that are working on your files. One other thing that I wanted to show you about the layer panel is that you can change the opacity of different layers. So I'm going to bring back my eyeball here and my stopwatch icon, and I will hide my shape layers. Maybe what I'll do is I'll create a new folder for my shape layers so that we can hide them all at once. Call that shapes. And I'll just drag my shapes into that folder. Close the folder, and we will turn the eyeball off on that particular folder. Now, this layer 3 was a new layer that I created, doesn't have anything on it, so I'm just going to drag it to the trash can down here and we'll get rid of it. Now we have a very nicely organized file that has our shapes in a folder, our text all grouped together, and I'll turn that off as well for the time being, our eyeball layer named and our stopwatch layer named. One of the other aspects I wanted to show you is how to increase or decrease the transparency of a particular layer. So we have our stopwatch layer that's completely opaque. On top of the eyeball layer, there is a slider here in the layer menu called the opacity slider. If you click on the button next to where it says 100%, you get a little slider that you can turn down, and that will decrease the opacity of the pixels in that layer. So I can effectively blend together the stopwatch layer with the eyeball layer below it. All right. That's something that you can change at any time. So if I wanted to come back to the eyeball layer and maybe turn that opacity down as well so that we saw the star field through the eyeball and the stopwatch layer, I now have layers at both of these layers at 50%, right, which is kind of a neat effect. I can go back to the stopwatch layer if I want to make that a little bit stronger, and I can turn that setting up a little bit if I want to. Right, so you can manipulate the opacity of the layers. Another way to blend layers together is using blending modes. right? So the blending modes allow you to determine how the pixels in one layer combine with the pixels in another layer. And you just have to scroll through here to see how these layers interact with these different blending modes. They will act differently depending on the blending mode, and you just have to kind of get used to seeing what they do before you can decide which one is actually going to be the best one for you to use. In this case, I think I'm going to try one that is in this upper section that will leave the darker pixels and drop out the lighter pixels, like multiply. So you can use the opacity and the multiply, the opacity and the blending modes pop up to merge different layers together in a variety of different ways. Photoshop has a variety of tools to allow you to manipulate different aspects of your image, whether it be the tonal aspect, the light and dark values in the image, or the color of each of the pixels in your image. And almost all of those tools are found in the Image Adjustments menu. There you can see brightness and contrast at the very top, levels, curves, exposure, vibrance, hue, saturation, color balance, etc., etc. So there are a wide variety of them. When you select them from this menu, for instance, if we choose brightness and contrast, that brightness and contrast setting is going to be applied to whatever layer is active. So you can see I have my eyeball layer active here. The brightness and contrast setting will be used to change the brightness and contrast of just that particular layer. I've turned on the preview button here so we can see that in real time as we use it. If we turn the brightness up, you can see that just that layer, that eyeball layer, gets brighter as we move to the right, and it can get darker as we move to the left. Contrast, likewise, will increase or decrease the contrast in your image, making it more black and white, making those black and white tones farther apart from each other, or less black and white and making it a little less low contrast. That's not really doing a whole lot to this image, so I'm going to turn that back to its default. But the brightness setting, I think, does help a little bit for this image. So we'll say OK for that. Now, if I click OK at this point, those changes are going to be applied directly to that eyeball layer, and they will become permanent. So I'm going to cancel this and show you a different way to apply those kinds of changes in a non-destructive manner, so that you can apply those changes to your image without actually changing the pixels in your image. And we do that through adding a special kind of layer called a layer adjustment layer. And that is accessed via the menu at the bottom, the fourth one over from the right-hand side here, the one that looks like a little half black and half white circle. Click on that, and you get that same pop-up that you had at the Image Adjustments menu. There's our brightness and contrast adjustment, hue, saturation, etc. So I'm going to choose brightness contrast again, and we get a couple of different changes now. We have a new layer with a little brightness and contrast icon, and then we have our brightness and contrast adjustment here in the properties palette. And if I move that contrast, that brightness up, you can see that now it's brightening up the image, but it's also brightening up the background image. So the way the image adjustment layers work is they affect every layer below them. So not only are we affecting the eyeball layer, but we're also affecting the background layer, which in this case I think is fine, but it would be nice if we could just have that adjustment affect the eyeball layer right below it. Well, we can do that by selecting our image adjustment layer, just making sure that's highlighted, holding down the Alt key on the Windows machine and the Option key on the Mac, and then mousing over the space that line that separates the eyeball layer and the image adjustment layer. And you see that my cursor changes to a square with an arrow pointing downward. While I'm holding down the Alt key or Option key, if I click there, my layer changes and gets that little arrow in it, letting me know that this image adjustment now is only going to be affecting the layer right below it, and that would be the eyeball layer. So now I can choose to adjust that brightness, and it will not affect the brightness of the background layer, only the eyeball layer. Right, so that's an image adjustment layer. A very handy thing to be able to do because we can turn it off and there's our image back again the way it was before. And that's really at the heart of a non-destructive workflow, a workflow that doesn't change your pixels in your image irrevocably, and one that we usually want to maintain. Now if I want to change the color of the background layer, I'll click on the background layer and again go to my image adjustment menu, my layer adjustment menu, and click. And this time I'll choose the hue saturation adjustment layer, and I get a new layer here, which will again affect all of the layers below it. But since there's only one layer below it, I don't need to go ahead and create a clipping mask like I did here in the eyeball adjustment layer, because it's only going to be affecting the background, which is what I want. In the Properties panel, we have some new adjustments here for the hue saturation command. We can change the hue of the background, and we can cycle through all those different colors in the background. We can also change the saturation intensity of those colors. We can make them more saturated. So as we scroll through those colors, you can see that those colors become more saturated. And maybe we'll change this to be something a little more pink and purple rather than the bluish and reddish colors that we had before. Lightness and darkness will change the lightness and darkness of all of the pixels on that layer. So I don't find that to be very useful when using a hue saturation adjustment. I just manipulate the hue and the saturation primarily. So again, there we have an image adjustment layer that we can turn off to go back to our original image, or we can go back in by double-clicking on the icon in that adjustment layer and reevaluate the changes that we made. If we want to change and adjust those changes, we can do that as well. We can also use the opacity slider for those image adjustment layers as well. So if I decide that my change here to the background layer by making the hue and saturation really vibrant is too much, I can adjust that a little bit by turning it down with the opacity slider. So I can make that 70% strength adjustment using the opacity slider. So lots of different ways that you can manipulate your layers here in the Layers palette. One last thing I want to show you about the Layers palette before we get to our final section, which is how to save files, is how to make layer effects. Layer effects allow you to do special effects to areas of a layer that are transparent. So for instance, we have our text layers. I'll just turn our text layers back on here. And one of the things we can do is we can add a drop shadow to the text, a darker value sort of behind the text in order to make it stand out a little bit more. To add a drop shadow, let me just open my folder with my text in it here. Select the text layer that you would like to perform an effect on, and then you can choose the FX button here at the bottom of the layer palette, the second one from the left. And you can choose what type of layer effect you want to use. We're going to choose Drop Shadow. And that's going to open up the Layer Style palette and select Drop Shadow, which is down here at the bottom. And I don't know if you can see it very well or not. Let me just zoom in a little bit. and our image has a drop shadow applied to it. We can change the distance, the spread, and the size of that drop shadow, and you can see that as we do that, it tightens up that text layer, and we've got a little bit of a drop shadow behind it. I can change the direction of the drop shadow, so now the drop shadow is to the right of the text. If I wanted to make that very distant, making it look like I have a distance between my text and the shadow, I can do that. I can make it spread out a little bit more, right, and increase the size so I get a really large sort of spread out shadow for the text. And that really helps the text stand out a little bit more from the background. If I turn the preview off and on, I think you can see what that is doing. Click OK, and then we'll move over to our yellow text here, and we'll do a similar kind of thing. Again, I'll select that text layer and choose, this time I'm going to make the text glow, so I'm going to use outer glow, and that will open up my layer styles and choose outer glow, and I can increase the spread of the glow and the size of the glow, and you can see what's happening there to my letters. Right? So that kind of effect is also one that you can use when you have an object that is not filling the entire screen. We couldn't do this kind of thing on one of the image layers because there's no transparency. Excuse me, you have to have a kind of transparency in order to be able to do these effects. Other effects that we could choose here for the text, we could do an inner glow, we could do a color overlay, we could stroke the text, give it an outline, we could bevel and emboss the text. You can see that now the text sort of looks like it's raised up to a degree, and we can increase the depth of that by playing around with these sliders, give it contour or a texture. So lots of different things you can do to make your objects on a transparent background stand out. And predominantly these kinds of effects are used for text and to make text stand out. I'm just going to back to my move tool and zoom out a little bit. Oh, there we go. Okay, so once you've got an image that you're happy with and we want to save that file after you've been working on your project, it's important to save it properly to preserve your layers and ensure compatibility across different platforms. Photoshop provides multiple saving and exporting options depending on your needs. So let's go over how to save your files as both a Photoshop file and how to export it for the web or sharing as a JPEG file. To save your file as a Photoshop file, which will preserve all of the layers in your file and the masks and adjustments and any other editable elements, making it ideal for saving a file to come back to it in the future and modify it. You save a file as a PSD file by going to the File menu and choosing Save As. And we're just going to save that into our Pictures folder here. And I'm going to save that with a name, my name, as the last name, and then the project name. And then I usually like to add an indication of which version of this file that I'm working with. Whether I'm working with the first version, the second version, so I will put V1 if it's the first version of this file. And you always want to make sure that you're saving it as the type you're expecting. So in the pop-up list down below here, we want to save as type PSD, right? You'll note that all of these 4 file formats that are available here large document format, Photoshop, PDF, and TIFF are all file formats that will save the layers in your image. They all do it in a different kind of way, but for now, the most basic one, the Photoshop native file format, is the one that we want to use, the .psd file format. So make sure that's selected. You always want to make sure that the ICC profile is also selected. By default, that's the screen RGB color profile. So we'll click that to make sure that our color is able to be translated between devices accurately. And click Save, and it will save your file with all of the layers intact to that location that you've selected in the Save window. Now, alternatively, when you're saving an image to be posted to the World Wide Web or shared via email, you may want to flatten the image down to one layer and save it as a JPEG. JPEG is what's called a lossy or compressed format. It doesn't save all those layers. Saving all those layers, like in a Photoshop file, makes your file very large when you write it to the disk. And in general, we don't want to send very large files via email or over the web. So we want to flatten it to make it a JPEG and make it quite a bit smaller. To do that, we go to the File Export menu, and we want to Save for Web Legacy. There are a couple of different ways that you can save a JPEG. This is the one that I prefer because it gives you the most options for saving your JPEG file. When you go to File, Export, Save for Web Legacy, you get this Save for Web window that gives you a bunch of different options. It gives you a big preview of your image. There's a pop-up at the top that lets you access different web-friendly formats. You'll see the GIF format here, or GIF, depending on how you pronounce it, and JPEG, and a PNG file, both in an 8-bit form and a 24-bit form, as well as a web bitmap file. We want to choose the JPEG file format, and one of the options you have is for the quality of the file, and we want to choose a high or very high quality or maximum quality. The difference between these is one of size. Primarily, you will see probably a very slight change in the quality of the visual quality of the file from low to maximum. I don't know if you can see that in this recording, probably not. But there is a significant change in terms of the size of the file. So if we change it to low and we look down here in the corner, we see that at low quality, it's only 180 kilobytes, which is a tiny amount of data. If we increase that to maximum quality, the quality goes up to a little bit higher. Visually, there's not much difference, but in terms of the disk size of the file, it's now 2.149 megabytes. So from 100 kilobytes to 2 megabytes is a huge change. From maximum to very high is 1.27, almost a cutting in half of the file size. So I think in terms of best quality for size, performance ratio, very high is where you want to be most of the time. Again, embed the color profile by clicking on that little icon and convert to sRGB. We can check out what the file size of our image is here, and if you need to make it even smaller, you can do that here. You can either change the percentage size of the file. 50% is going to be half as big, and that will be fine for most web page images. But you can control the size there if you need to make your image fit within a particular size. Sometimes when you're applying to things, they will say make a JPEG image no bigger than 1200 pixels. So that's the way that you can precisely control the size of your JPEG. And then if we click in those boxes again, we can see that the size reduces and we can see more of our image in the preview. Then click Save, and it will ask you where you want to save your file. I'm just going to choose my desktop here, and again, level project 01-v1 JPEG, and click Save. Okay. Now you'll notice that that has not flattened our working image layers. We still have the image that we were working on. It still has all its layers, but that copy that we made, if we go to File, Open, and open that JPEG copy that we just made, you can see that it has been flattened to just one layer. So those two now exist as independent files. That's it. Now you've got a solid foundation in Photoshop. Keep practicing and exploring different tools, and in subsequent videos we'll dive into more advanced editing techniques. Don't forget to save your work, and happy Photoshopping.